Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
On this episode of New Mexico Now, we will discuss primary election results as candidates move towards the general election. And we will also talk about how the largest utility in the state got involved in primary races for the state's Public Regulation Commission. This is New Mexico Now. Welcome to New Mexico Now. I'm your host, Anthony Moreno. Joining us in studio is Walt Rubel, editorial page editor of the Las Cruces Sun News, and Sylvia Ulloa from New Mexico In Depth. Thank you both for joining us. U.S. Representative Michelle Lujan Grisham won the Democratic primary and moves on to face Republican Congressman Steve Pearce, who was uncontested in the primary. Let's get a better understanding of this race. First off, let's talk about the Democratic primary. Obviously, that was a three-person race there at the end. Lujan Grisham won with 66% of the vote. Any surprises there?
Not really. I at the beginning of the race, I thought that maybe Joseph Cervantes would do a little bit better than he did, being the one member of the state legislature who was running in that field. But for whatever reason, never able to really get much traction up north. Lujan Grisham comes in with a big name, having been a member of Congress, and never really was challenged in that race, I don't think.
Sylvia, you interviewed the candidates as well in this. Any thoughts on that primary?
Yeah, I would agree with Walt in that I was surprised that Joe Cervantes didn't do better. He was a really thoughtful candidate. He had a lot of experience, and I think somehow if you wanted to do the anti-establishment, it instead went to Apodaca, and I think that's also a name recognition issue. Yeah. I think Heath Hausman had a really interesting column when he talked about that, though, about how southern New Mexico politicians can't really make some traction statewide because of some of the media environment in New Mexico. Pretty much the whole rest of the state of New Mexico, except Doña Ana County, gets Albuquerque media.
Right.
And so they don't really pay it, Albuquerque media doesn't pay attention to Las Cruces. And that kind of puts a disadvantage, I think, to the folks that are running around here because their name doesn't get out statewide. I thought that was a pretty interesting thing. I think the fact that Joe Cervantes didn't campaign sooner than he did was probably a little bit to do with his poor showing. Like I said, I think he had some really, fine policy positions. I think he would have done a good job.
I do too. And I really think that race came down to this is the year of the progressives in the Democratic Party. Joseph Cervantes has always been a moderate. He's always been somebody who kind of positions himself more to the business perspective, more to the law and order type of perspective. Not certainly as much as Susana Martinez, but in comparison to that field. And Apodaca, his whole thing was economic development. I think in a different year that might have sold better. But I just think people are ready for a change after 8 years of Susana Martinez. And they sort of saw Lujan Grisham as this big name who was going to come in from Washington, D.C. And be able to make sweeping changes all at once or in a great big hurry. And I think that's probably as much as anything what carried it for her.
One of the things with that primary, an issue that came up was the legalization of the recreational use of marijuana. Apodaca obviously talked about it consistently and gained some traction on that. Cervantes didn't support it. He supported the decriminalization of it.
Yeah, that's another area where he was a little bit more moderate, a little bit more centrist than what his position was that until they have some kind of roadside sobriety test, like you can do now with alcohol, he wasn't going to support it. And so who knows how many years down the road that might be. Lujan Grisham has the position that once she is satisfied that the public safety aspects of it have been addressed, then she said she'd be okay with going ahead with it. But she wasn't one of those jump on board from the first day and this is going to restart our economy.
So now we have, two main candidates in this race from the big parties here in the state. Michelle Lujan Grisham running for the Democratic Party, and with the Republican Party, we have Steve Pearce. Both are U.S. representatives. Both are in Washington. When this race first started, did you think that immigration might be a top issue within this race?
Yeah, it's pretty rare that you have two candidates running for governor, and you can look on issue by issue by issue. You can go and look at and see how their voting record lines up against each other. And certainly on the immigration issue, I think it's going to be a challenge for Steve Pearce. He last week voted for the Good Lot immigration bill that deals with not only illegal immigration in DACA, but also makes changes and reductions to our legal immigration system. And that is seen as a hardline conservative bill. So that is certainly consistent with the position that he has had his entire time in Congress. But now that he's running for governor, I think there will be some questions about those policies and what it would mean for the state of New Mexico if he would have been successful in getting those bills passed through the House.
Steve Terrell with the Santa Fe New Mexican wrote an interesting column of commentary about what is, he said, I think, trouble for Trump could be trouble for Steve Pearce. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I would say there's just been a recent poll out that kind of shows that Michelle Lujan Grisham is got a pretty good lead on Steve Pearce. What was interesting about that is that the top three issues are crime, education, and immigration. And in two of those three, I think Michelle Lujan Grisham is going to be on stronger footing. Mm-hmm. She's certainly got the backing of the education establishment in New Mexico, and the immigration thing is going to be really tricky for Pearce. I mean, I think he's been a little more nuanced than most Republicans would be because he represents a border district, but signing on to Good Lot is not going to be, I mean, that's just a campaign ad waiting to happen.
Right.
And he does say that he supports a fix for DACA, but it's certainly not as generous as it would be. And another thing is that there was recent data out there, polling showing that support for Trump has fallen across the United States, but New Mexico is the lead drop in support for President Trump, and I think that's going to reflect on Pearce and also on the CD2, the Congressional District 2 candidate.
Yeah, from the very beginning, Pearce has had this sort of uneasy relationship with Donald Trump. 2 years ago in the election, he tried to walk this line where he was saying, well, I support him, but I don't endorse him. And trying to explain what the difference between, exactly, whatever that is. So he has, he's tried to have it both ways. He's tried to not anger the base of his party, which is clearly the Trump supporters are the base of the Republican Party, while still playing to whatever's left of the moderates.
Oh, it's interesting to see what's going to happen with that topic. One of the other topics that I want to discuss briefly here, because we just have a little over 2 minutes left, is there's been a number of reports and also some in-depth reporting done about early childhood education in the state and child well-being. Sylvia, you've been a part of that. Do you see this issue being discussed as much and now that immigration and obviously public safety are going to be in that conversation in this race? Oh,
I think it's going to be one of the main issues. I mean, it's number two as far as, it's only behind crime for interest in the state. There's been a really polarizing change in education in the state, and that's one of the reasons why people are pretty interested in it. They don't like the teacher evaluation system, and there's a big support for early childhood education, for going into the land grant permanent fund to fund it. There's just been a lot of support for that. I think that the candidates are definitely going to have to speak to that issue, and not only that, but no matter who it is, if it's Steve Pearce, he's going to be working with a Democratic legislature that already backs that.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see how he might work with that legislature to either tamp that down or or redirect monies from early childhood to K through 12.
And I would argue that those issues are related. Certainly crime and early childhood education. I mean, all the statistics show that the investment now pays off down the road in lower crime rates and spending.
Higher graduation rates.
Exactly.
Well, I guess it's just one of the interesting things is Pierce hasn't really discussed, I guess, he says he's not against expanding it, but he said he wanted to fix the current system as it is.
Fix the current system. And there is definitely a cohort within the education community that says that's how you fix K through 12. But he definitely wants to, I mean, he's pretty clear on wanting to change the teacher evaluation system, which is, is facing 2 lawsuits in the state. He wants to look at increasing wages for for teachers, and a couple of other things. There's a lot of agreement in those ways between Grisham and Pierce. I think they understand that the state is very frustrated with how education is in this state, and so both of them are going to be looking to make big changes.
Well, we'll see how that unfolds over the next months here, but I want to move on to the next topic. State Representative Yvette Harrell won the Republican primary for the 2nd congressional district seat, where she faces the winner of the Democratic primary, water attorney Xochitl Torres Small. This congressional district is one of the largest in the country. Let's talk about what's happening in this race. First of all, I want to talk about the primary, specifically in the GOP race. It was a tight race. Well, did you see any surprises with that race?
Yeah, I was totally surprised. We did a show a month ago before the election, and you asked at that time if we thought that whoever was closest to Trump would win that primary. And my response was no, because I thought Monty Newman, who I thought was the establishment choice, had all the money, the oil money. So my thinking at that time was that would hold sway, which it typically has in New Mexico. Those kinds of old-time establishment connections have, in the past, meant a whole lot. In this election, they didn't. In this election, it did, I think, come down to who was closer to Donald Trump. And it clearly was Yvette Harrell. And so I think it sets up as a very interesting general election race between 2 women who are both very comfortable in their beliefs. They don't have to think a lot about the talking points. I mean, it just comes very easily to them. They believe what they believe. And I hope there will be a lot of debates and a good, robust discussion, because both of them have the ability to articulate, for Xochitl, it's the progressive position, and for Yvette, it's the conservative position very well. And so I think this could be a very interesting campaign.
An interesting campaign, one that is going to have to deal with the immigration issue, obviously being a border district. Any thoughts on how that's going to impact this race?
I think that it'll be really interesting, because that same poll that I was looking at showed Harrell just essentially trouncing Xochitl Torres Small right now. I think it was like 50 to 35 or somewhere around there. And that was right around when all of the family separation things started to bubble up. I mean, she is pretty hardline. She's to the right of Steve Pierce, who's pretty right at this point. And I can't imagine how that's going to play out, because I actually would say that you sort of said it before, that it's the year of the progressive, and I think that the Republican voters that are coming out, they're all the hardliners, and so this is definitely going to be a real, like, who do you choose in this race? Because if you're a moderate, you're really going to have a tough decision. This is one area where I think that this was a perfect place for Joe Cervantes to be the candidate.
I wrote a column at the very beginning of this process when it looked like Aubrey Dunn was going to be the Republican candidate. And there were 4 Democrats in at that time. Matt Hildebrand was the only one of those 4 who made it all the way through. But none of them had ever run for anything before. And that is the challenge that I think Xochitl is going to have, is that she starts this race at a huge disadvantage in terms of name recognition and just experience. Yvette Harrell, I think, has won 4 races, if I remember right, for her House seat. And so she's built up that campaign. she's built up that organization, not certainly to the extent that she'll need to run a congressional race, but she has that advantage going in. And I know that Social has been working hard and going all over the district, but she has some ground to make up, I think, going in.
Yeah, well, if you think about the national, the national Democrats trying to match the candidates with the district, they could not possibly have picked two people who were like the least far from this congressional district, because this is a Republican-leaning district, but it is not a hardline district. It sits on the border. It has a lot of sympathy for Central American immigrants, people that are only one generation removed from not being American citizens. So, I think somebody as progressive as Social Tories is going to be a tough swallow, and I think somebody as conservative as Yvette Herrold is going to be a tough swallow. So that'll be really interesting to see how it goes forward.
One of the other things, though, this seat, has been historically a Republican seat for many years.
Yeah, forever. With the one exception of when Harry Teague snuck in one year when Steve Pierce decided to run for Senate instead. That's it. It's been Joe Skeen or Steve Pierce.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see how this unfolds. One of the things that also kind of surprised me after this primary was Governor Susana Martinez was quoted in the Albuquerque Journal kind of firing some shots at Yvette Herrold, saying, quote, "There are some questions with reference to her ability to represent New Mexico in a fair and reasonable way." Does this statement by the governor, what are your thoughts on that? Does it help or hurt Herrold?
Well, it hurts her, clearly. I'm not sure how plugged in anymore the governor is to the state Republican Party and that apparatus. And I suspect this is some sort of the residue or carryover between what has been 8 incredibly contentious years between the governor and the legislature. Yvette Herrold has been a member of the legislature for most of that time. But that's the most I could make of that statement. That seemed very odd to me, that the Republican governor at the beginning of that race would take a pot shot at the Republican candidate for U.S. House.
And also the former, or the current seat holder, Steve Pierce. She did sort of gave him a back slap in that same article. So
yeah, so I don't know if that's the governor positioning for what comes next for her. I'm just not sure.
So we have some questions there that I think with that statement. Now I want to move on to the next topic. In the recent primary election, PNM Resources, the parent company of PNM, the largest utility in the state, contributed $440,000 to support candidates running for New Mexico's Public Regulation Commission through a political action committee, New Mexicans for Progress. I know, Walt, you wrote a commentary about this, and Sylvia, you have an interesting tool with NM in Depth that really kind of breaks things down. I'd kind of like to start with you real quick. What are some things that you're taking away from this, just in numbers?
Well, one thing that I would say is a pretty interesting take on this is, well, not to get too number geeky here, but outside spending in this race was far outstripped what the candidates actually raised themselves. I think that there's a lot of people that were kind of wondering, why is the public PNM trying to choose its own regulators? I think that caused a bit of a backlash to those candidates. But PNM spent about $209,000 on PRC races for the incumbents. And then there was the oil and gas industry that spent about another 130, I think, more. So that's, the candidates themselves only spent 230. Well, between the two, they got completely outmatched. And the takeaway, though, is that money isn't everything, because they spent a lot of money trying to keep those incumbents in, and neither of them kept their seats.
And one of the things, they spent a lot of money from that they earned or made from customers in the state who may not have a choice to get their utilities anywhere else but with PNM. What does that say, Walt, when you have this issue going on in an election for the regulatory body that regulates utilities.
Yeah, and I would add that the Public Regulation Commission is one of those races that does have public financing available. And in this case, both candidates decided to forego that and to raise all kinds of secret under the table money. And this race was incredibly frustrating to me. It demonstrates that New Mexico has no umpire when it comes to what's fair and foul in elections. It was probably 4 weeks before the election when Sandy Jones raised the first complaint. He was complaining about what they call interveners, people who take a participatory role in a rate case. They can be an intervener. And there is a rule that says interveners cannot donate to PRC candidates. But then there's a part of it that says it doesn't apply to an election. So it's a very confusing rule. And so, 4 weeks before the election, he says this is unfair, and he sends it off to the Secretary of State. Secretary of State says nothing. About a week later, Steve Fishman fires back and says he's getting money from lobbyists. He can't do that. Well, once again, the law on that is unclear. Once again, Steve Fishman sends his complaint to the Secretary of State. Once again, the Secretary of State does nothing. About 2 weeks before the election, all of this gets shipped over to the Attorney General, who we have yet to hear from. And so you have an election that goes forward where both sides are alleging that the other side collected money illegally. There's no dispute as to whether they collected the money or not. The only question is whether it was allowed under the law, whether it was allowed under the law, and we can't get an answer to that question.
Well, if we can't get an answer, I mean, what's going on here? Is the Secretary of State's office passing things off to the Attorney General's office? Are they passing the buck, Walt?
I think they are. I think part of that is because they don't have an enforcement division there that has any kind of resources and any kind of teeth to what they do. And so New Mexico has all of these election laws, but if you have nobody enforcing it, and if the Attorney General comes out 2 months after the election and says, well, they really shouldn't have been able to do that, in the case of PNM Resources, that's an issue where they're saying, well, we're not a regulated utility. That's PNM that's the regulated utility. We're PNM Resources. Totally different. Well, they've got the same officers, the same board, the same everything.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Sylvia, just like getting at these numbers and trying to understand them and access to them, how's that?
Well, I think that things in New Mexico could be better in the transparency game, and I think that most media companies would say that. But there is really ways that people can look at who's giving money to the different candidates, whether that's Steve Pierce, Michelle Lujan Grisham, or just your PRC regulator. I mean, I think the fact that we're even talking about PRC is pretty good because who follows these obscure races, but. They're really important because that's something that'll actually affect you in your mailbox when you get your bill. We have a tool at New Mexico In Depth called the Openness Project, and you can pretty much just type in a name. It's a lot easier than the Secretary of State's website, but the Secretary of State's website does have a lot of information out there if you really care and are curious. I think it's a little bit of a backstop against a lot of this flooding of money into the system. What's bad about it though is that this PAC doesn't have to say who they're supporting. The only way you would know that is if you look at the little taglines on who paid for this. And if you didn't see that, you have no idea who is for or against a candidate. They have no requirement under New Mexico law to say, I'm supporting, I'm doing this ad buy in support of this candidate. I mean, the PAC that was trying to influence the Democratic race was run by a GOP strategist. I mean, it was Jay McCluskey, Governor Martinez's political consultant. So, this is a lot of money sloshing around in there, and a regular person doesn't really have a whole lot other than their voice. But in the end, their vote did make a difference. I think that there were people who were kind of disgusted. They wanted somebody who was really more consumer oriented on the PRC board, and that's who, other than, I'm not sure about the northern New Mexico candidate.
Well, I want to talk about just, obviously an official with PNM said that, they had a legal right to inform, quote, inform the public of these policy issues. Yeah. Well, you had some issues with that statement because of the money that was used in these campaigns.
Yeah, no, what they said was, well, we're doing education here. We're educating the voters. Well, there was nothing in their ad about rates. There was nothing in their ad about solar energy. There was nothing in their ad about, making the transition from coal to other sources. There was nothing educational at all. Their ad was this attack piece on Steve Fishman using his voting record as a senator and twisting it to make it sound like he was against kids and he was against education. He was against all of these things that he had a pretty solid record of being for.
So you think that that's really not the case, and what that statement was in defending their use of that money?
No, I'm certain that wasn't the case. I mean, that PAC that Sylvia was talking about has a pretty, the people behind that PAC have a pretty good reputation, for running negative political attack ads. And the late mailers that come in your mailbox 2 days before the election, and the ads that show up the weekend before the election where there's not enough time to respond to them.
All right, well, we just have about a minute left, but with this issue, and just in general, this issue can come up in many races in New Mexico. How does this get fixed? Well, you talked about how does the state really shut the back door, to influence these races?
Well, one of the things, I'm hopeful that the Ethics Commission that's going to be on the ballot in November, it's a constitutional amendment. I'm hoping that maybe that will provide a mechanism where people can go to and can get more immediate answers to these questions. Because right now, neither the Secretary of State or the Attorney General's office are set up to really be able to handle those kinds of issues. And you need somebody because they come up every single election.
All right, well, we want to thank you both for being here. Thank you to Walt Rubel and Sylvia Ulloa for joining us for New Mexico Now. You can like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at KRWG for the latest news and programming announcements. And remember, we would love to hear your story ideas and topics for this program and others. Email us anytime at feedback@nmsu.edu. I'm Anthony Moreno. Thanks for joining us.